delight to have Khristi. I've gotten to know Khristi a little bit. I mentioned that she works at St. Paul's School. That is the school that our church is connected with. And so she arrived not many months ago. I don't know. August or July, August, she arrived. And when you look at her bio, award-winning author. And her new book, which she's going to talk about. So I'm gonna turn things over to Khristi. Do you want me to give you a heads up? 5 minutes to go?
You know what? Since I have my laptop here, I think we're okay.
I'm turning things over
Thank
to
you.
Khristi.
Hi. It's a pleasure to be here, and I guess I came right on time because it was a right on time message. I'm going to give you a little bit of background. I want to talk about my book, but I really want to talk about the work sort of surrounding the book as opposed to being like sort of a marketing, advertising book person right now. Last February, or maybe this February, earlier this year, it's been a long year, guys. I was invited to speak at St. Andrew's Episcopal School in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I spoke at the People of Color Conference a few years ago, and when I was there, I did a conversation or a talk about the experiences of Black girls in predominantly white independent schools. And when I was there, the person from St. Andrews invited me to come just to speak to the faculty, to speak to the students, speak to just everybody under the sun. I think I did 7 hours there. And so when I was there, I spoke to the entire high school. They had a K through 12 school. After that, I spoke to the administrators. I spoke to the girls. I had a lunch and learn with the parents. It was just a really full day. Finally, at the end, I had a book signing. I have 3 books. One is called Parable of the Brown Girl. The second one is called Unbossed, How Black Girls Are Leading the Way. And the third one is called Womanish Theology, that was mentioned a bit earlier. And so after this full day of starting to speak at 7 a.m., it's 3 p.m., I'm hungry, I'm ready to go back to the hotel because during the lunch and learn, they were learning and lunching and I was just speaking. And so at the end of the day, there was a young girl, middle school. I signed her book and I saw her standing on the side and I said, "Did you need something else from me?" And she said, "No, I just have a question and I'll just wait here." And there was this long line. I was like, "Are you sure?" She said, "Okay, yeah, I am." So I forgot that she was even there, finished signing the books, was getting ready to leave. I saw her still standing really patiently on the side, and I went over to her, and I said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." I said, "What did you want to talk about?" She said, "I had a question." And I said, "What was your question?" And she said, have you ever not liked the way you looked? And I said, "Yeah, that has happened many times in my life." She's like, "Have you ever not liked yourself?" And I said, "Yeah, that happened too many times in my life." And I said, "Why? Do you not like yourself?" And she said, "Yeah, no." And I said, "Do you not like the way you look?" And she said, "No." And this girl is maybe 11 years old. And I'm thinking, wow, like maybe God had me fly all the way to this school, not for these like grand conversations and large audiences, but maybe it was just for this little girl that was just like waiting patiently, because I kept thinking to myself, this is why I do the work that I do. This is why I've sort of centered in on this particular demographic. I'm going to read you a clip or a little bit of my first book, Parable of the Brown Girl. It's something very similar. And so in the book, I write, I remember the first time someone called me the N-word. I remember the first time someone called me darky. I remember the first time someone called me nappy-headed. These racist moments remain etched in my memory, teaching me from a young age that Black girls are undesired and rejected. It has taken me years to renounce these messages and to recover from their harmful effects. I'm amazed by how much Black women and girls have to unlearn. We are born into a system designed to oppose every aspect of our identity, including our skin complexion, hair, our attitude, and our overall identity as women. The antagonism we face begins at such a young age and from so many different directions that even the most spiritually, emotionally, and physically protected Black girls will have a difficult time encountering it. So I wanted to start there, start with the story of the young girl that I met earlier this year, my own story of being on the playground, to give you just a little bit of an sort of an idea as to why I've honed in on this demographic and do the work that I do. When I've always been called to work with young people in general, and there's so much going on in the world, and there are so many people unnoticed and overlooked that it's like so hard not to take on every single issue, every single everything. And I used to teach this class called Religion and Film, and when we got on the topic of religion and social justice, I would put the slide up on PowerPoint of just all the different issues there are in the world and all the different demographics of people, all of the different marginalized identities, like the things that, like, whether it's climate change, whether it's working with like youth advocacy, criminal justice. I said, this will overwhelm you if you try to take everything on. And it's not to say that we're not supposed to have a heart for all of these issues. We are, but sometimes God has called us to a particular area. That's why we're called the body of Christ, right? Like, there are some of us that serve one particular stream, one another. So when people ask me when I'm doing this work, why Black girls, I always say, well, why not, for starters? And secondly, that this is the demographic that I feel like God has called me to, not to say that I don't have a heart for these other areas, right? So I usually try to tell our students or my students that I work with, you don't have to take on the entire PowerPoint, but if your heart is leaning toward one particular direction, or if you're feeling a little bit more of a burden for one area or another area, then maybe that's the area that God's called you to, but you're not a bad person just because you're not outside marching on behalf of fill in the blank, right? Your thing might be your thing. And so this has been my thing. I was just a little girl hearing these messages, just like the young girl that I met all of those years later, earlier this February, on the playground in a space where we're taught we should be colorblind. That was the message that I got sort of growing up in the 90s, right? We're taught that we are all the same, but I was different. I felt different. I was also told that I was different. So when I talk about Black girlhood, again, it's not to take away from anyone else's identity. There are a plethora, like I said, of ethnic and cultural identities, even represented in this room. But I always break down before I even start talking about my current book, is like, why Black girlhood? And people are trying to figure out what does that even mean? So many of you already know, cultural identity, it refers to sort of this sense of belonging and identification with one particular group. And so instead of saying, for me, I don't always say African American girlhood because all of the diaspora does not necessarily, come from that part of Africa. So I always say Black people, Black identity, right? It refers to both racial classification and cultural identity. So when I say Black girlhood, I'm talking about that racial identity and racial classification alongside the experiences of girls 18 and under. And I'm very specific about that. And I've heard the term, there's Black girl magic and Black girl this, and a lot of times it refers to adults, but I'm talking about adolescents, 18 and under specifically. Black girls have their own experiences that shape who they are in their identity, experiences that are specific to them, good, bad, and otherwise. There's language that is specific to them. There's a way of seeing the world that is specific to them. And what they deserve, I believe, is to be listened to and to be heard and to be seen and valued and taken seriously. But what winds up happening is people overlook or disregard. Usually the smaller the classification or the smaller the demographic, the more they probably, have a tendency to be overlooked. And I feel like my mission is to call that out and to bring attention to it. No, your life matters, your experience matters, your perspective matters just like everyone else's. An example of that, when I worked at a boarding school, so a little bit about me. I'm actually from New Jersey. I spent the last 6 years at a school called the Hill School in Pennsylvania, a boarding school That's all I'll say about the Hill. I don't know what else to say about that school. But I spent 6 years at a boarding school in Pennsylvania. I'm still amazed. And so then I wound up here in June, so thanks be to God. But when I was their Dean of Spiritual Life and Equity. So I oversaw spiritual life and oversaw diversity, equity, and inclusion. And during COVID, the students were not allowed to leave campus. We were in our own bubble, right? So we were already there 7 days a week, but even more so during COVID. And so when it was time for prom, they couldn't go off campus like they normally do to get, their hair and their nails done and things like that. So our student activities decided to bring people to campus. And so our student activities director, student life director said, we're gonna bring, someone to do hair, right? And I'm like, great, Now, out of the senior class, there were probably maybe 10 black girls, maybe, out of 150 or so. And so I asked the student activities director, I said, hey, did the person that's doing the hair, does that person know how to do, like, black girls' hair? And he's like, oh, yeah, I think so, maybe. And I'm like, oh, okay. I was like, so you hired someone to come, and they're just supposed to just kind of like go with it. And so I talked to the girls about it, and I said, what kind of hairstyles do you want? And they're like, I want braids, I want a sew-in, I want this, I want that. And I said, well, if they don't have someone to do your hair, they're like, it's okay. They used to call me PK. It's okay, PK. It's like, it's not a big deal. We'll figure it out. And I was like, oh, no, this is a battle that I'm going to fight. So I went back to the student life director, and I was like, hey, listen, we need to bring someone on campus. I don't care if there's 2 girls here that are black and there are more, then I think you need to bring someone that either knows somebody additional or somebody that knows how to do all different types of hair. So we wind up bringing somebody on campus, but that's just an example of what winds up happening. Because there's so few of them, then it's like, well, out of 150, there's only 10 of you, so 140 will get their hair done, and it's not a big deal if you won't get your hair done. Even something like, being in a classroom. I remember being in a classroom, and the girls, and one teacher told me that she had one black girl in her classroom, and they were doing something, dressing up, and they were supposed to bring in nude-colored stockings. So she brought in nude-colored stockings for everyone. And this one girl had darker complexion. And so the nude-colored stockings matched everybody except for this girl. But what she said she did, she recognized that as an issue, and she went and purchased stockings specifically for this girl. And she said, and it opened a door. Her whole face lit up when she bought her those stockings, because it was like they didn't even speak about it. And the girl couldn't even really articulate, but she knew that she saw her and that she cared. And so from that day forward, they had a great relationship. She came to her and talked to her. And so the reason why I'm saying this is because a lot of times these girls, even myself included, have a tendency to be overlooked. And they have something to offer the world, just like any other group that has a tendency to be overlooked. Even more so, they have to offer the world and offer us, as far as what it means to live like Christ and what it means to be a human being. So what I see happen is, because Black girlhood is not widely acknowledged as its own state of existence, because a lot of times people they're not even looking at these girls as having their own identity, as having their own experiences, right? They're just one of the number. It's not a big deal. And it happened to me, and it happens to them so much. Then what happens is Black girlhood experiences get pushed to the side as not even a real thing. So when Black girls speak up about their experiences, be it pleasant, favorable, or problematic, or disturbing, people can't see or hear it because it's not a real thing anyway. Even something is what you feel might be as minor as like a conference, and you might have a room full of people, right? And there might be 2 or 3 Black girls, and it's like, well, let me just throw somebody on the panel, one panel, you know what I mean, that might look like them. Those are big deals. Those are big deals. So it's not about pity or shame or victimhood. I think there's so much to love and so much to celebrate about young Black women and Black girls. There's so much to celebrate about their identities And we should want to get to know the intricacies of one another. Part of my work, I talk a lot about the Imago Dei and about the image of God and how we can learn from one another. If the image of God, if we're supposed to learn more about God and through one another and our diversity, everybody looks different, everybody comes from different backgrounds, everybody's so different, then there's so much for us to learn. If we were all created in the image of God, then even the least of these, it's like, wow, I have to learn. I mean, it's like so many people to go through in the world, right? And so that's how you live, and that's how you learn among one another as community. And that's why I think things like diversity are under attack right now. Because it's like the whole purpose is for us that we cannot just be one big melting pot. We'll never get closer to God if we're all that way, right? We get closer to God by learning and being in community with one another and celebrating and supporting one of our differences. And that's what diversity is. It's acknowledging the fact that we're not all the same, that we don't have the same experiences, and that's okay. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So I told the young girl, I love being a Black woman now. And I'm so sad as a young girl that I didn't have the resources or the support or the vocabulary to be able to say who I was in my girlhood, and that my girlhood was distinctive and my Black identity was distinctive and recognized and valued. I didn't have the permission to say as a 13-year-old, I have real experiences that are unique to me as a Black girl, or as a 14-year-old, I have real challenges that are unique to me as a Black girl. So my hope in my work, and I'll talk about that in a second, is that I challenge people to deconstruct their own perspectives or ideas of Black girlhood. A lot of times it's just what the media, what we get fed from media, what we get fed from sort of entertainment, right? The sort of like fun or the attitude or just like certain things that you probably just get when you see images of Black girls, as opposed to, wow, I can learn something from this demographic. I can learn something from these girls. We get stereotypes, we get fed, and we get fed misconceptions when we're not overlooked. Those are the things that they're up against. So I want to inspire people to engage with the Black girls around them more intentionally and more authentically outside of stereotypes and misconceptions. And how we do that is that we get to know, we make space. For the ones that we do have in our lives or within arm's length. Not everybody is around Black girls, and that's okay, but for those of us that are, whether we're teaching, whether they're in our communities or whatever, it's not about overdoing it or trying to over-relate. It's about engaging without appropriating. It's about listening to and believing Black girls when they speak up on something. It's about checking our own like microaggressions and our mess-ups. It's about developing authentic relationships and educating ourselves. Becoming an ally starts with a commitment to educating ourselves about the topics that we need to learn and unlearn in order to ensure that everyone is heard and respected, excuse me, and supported. We're supposed to speak up. And so regrettably, racism has caused Black women to be marginalized and judged based off of harmful stereotypes that hinder them. So if you hear something or you see something, help to challenge those stereotypes. And most importantly, it's more like, we don't run up, after talks like this, or for me, when I'm sitting and I'm learning about, other people or people of other backgrounds and saying, I learned about you today, it's not necessarily about that. It's just about being aware, and it's about being open and moving forward. So once I sort of acknowledge that, okay, these are real experiences that I had as a young person, and these are real experiences that these young girls are having today. I promised myself that if I ever had a platform, that I would use that platform in order to highlight and center those experiences. Everywhere that I've worked, I have usually been one of the only Black women in a visible position, particularly like in educational institutions. When I worked at Azusa Pacific University in Southern California. It's a Christian school, sort of evangelical, but like Southern California evangelicals, very different than what we know out here. They surf and go to the beach, and they're not out, taking away rights necessarily. So it's not as political as it probably sounds. But so I was in Southern California, and there was 4 campus pastors, and I was the only black woman, and the campus pastors were very visible. And so a lot of times the few black girls at the university would always like gravitate toward me and come to the office, and they just are like excited for no reason other than just have someone that looks like them. When I left there, I worked at Georgetown University and Georgetown University Law Center as a Protestant chaplain, and was the only black woman in those positions. And I was also a chaplain in residence at Georgetown University for a while too. At the Hill School, I was the first chaplain that they ever had that was anything other than a white man. And so usually those are spaces that I've been in, and so black girls have usually gravitated toward me. And I just thought it was because of who I was in those positions. I didn't really early on see it as like, oh, this might be something that God has like called me to. So it took a while for me to stumble and be able to get sort of like the language around that, as opposed to just feeling like I was just happened to be in those positions. I was doing some part-time counseling at a counseling center called Christian Wellness Center, and they hired me as a pastoral counselor. And for some reason, parents would bring in their daughters, from 9 years old to 17 years old to come talk to me, and they usually didn't want to come. They'd be standing in the corner, upset that they were forced to be there. And then eventually, as time went on, we would develop these really great relationships. And I remember leaving once and just feeling so full, like fuller than I've felt when I leave like a church service on Sunday morning, because just listening to them navigate the challenges in their lives at this small little corner counseling office center. No one is really checking for them. No one is really like, they're having to figure it out and figure out life on their own. And to just hear the girls and just hear them figure it out, and just their resilience and still their joy. Or even the girls that, were like, yeah, we might not have anybody to do our hair, but we'll figure it out, we'll do it ourselves, I just love that attitude and that spirit. And I remember leaving one day, and that was when I promised myself, because I've had all these experiences, if I ever have a platform, I'm going to write about these things that I am, these encounters that I'm having. So my first book, Parable of the Brown Girl, came out of that. A person that that followed me on the platform formerly known as Twitter said, we've seen some of the articles that you've been writing. I was writing for HuffPost. I actually wrote after the last election a post that went viral. Well, the 2016 election, I forgot about the 2021. But, and it was called, Will the Real Jesus Please Stand Up? And so she had seen that article, Will the Real Jesus Please Stand Up? And she said, we'd love for you to write for our company. And I said, I don't have anything to write about. And then I eventually got back to her and was like, oh, yes, I do. And so I got back to her, put a proposal together, and it was for the first book, Parable of the Brown Girl. And she said, I'm going to take it back to the team. And they rejected it. And they said, we feel like the demographic is too narrow. Can you write about all girls and put a chapter in there on black girls? And I said, wow, this is exactly the point that I'm trying to make. And it was then that I got really upset. It was like built a fire, like put a fire under me or something like that. And I said, well, I have this proposal, and I'm just gonna try to shop it somewhere else. I didn't know anything about writing books like that. And I pitched it to 2 publishing companies. Most companies won't take your pitch without an agent. I didn't have an agent, I didn't have anything. I just had this person on Twitter who reached out to me. But I sent it to 2 publishing companies, Fortress Press and InterVarsity, and they both accepted it, but I changed the proposal, and the first thing I wrote was, people don't care about black girls. I was like so angry because of, they were like wanting, once again, the last place that reached out to me wanted me to like share, I wanted them to share once again, very similar to everything that I've been saying. And they accepted it. And we got Parable. And Parable was more of me thinking to myself, when you're reading stories of Jesus and there's always those headlines and it's like, Jesus meets the woman, at the well or wherever. And I said, what if Jesus met one of these girls that I've encountered over the last 15 years in my career, what would it be called? And I was like, I think it would be called Parable of the Brown Girl. And that was really where that came from. And so I wrote 7 different stories, anonymous stories, of girls that I had met along the way, and basically some of the lessons that I had learned from their life, but also some of the lessons that I learned like culturally as a person, and then the lessons that I learned like spiritually. From there, I wrote a book called Unbossed, How Black Girls Are Leading the Way. Unbossed, I wrote right after COVID started. I don't know if you remember the Gen Zers, George Floyd, the whole thing. The Gen Zers were like, they are the ones, right? They were, doing class on Zoom, by day, and going out and leading marches at night. I mean, they were organizing, they were doing everything, and I was just fascinated with them. And I actually pitched something where I was going to write about Gen Z leaders just in general. And then the publishing company said, write about Black girl Gen Z leaders, right? So it was like the flipped opposite of what the first book was. And I said, yeah, they said, stick with what your niche is. And I said, okay. And then this last book, Womanish Theology, Discovering God Through the Lens of Black Girlhood, is more of a theological book in the sense of when I got to seminary, I went to Princeton Theological Seminary, and I remember thinking that I was so far behind because all of particularly my white male peers, all had this foreknowledge from day one. I mean, they could quote Karl Barth back and forth. They were raising their hands. It's like they had already knew theology. And I thought to myself, man, I got to start all over. I don't know theology. And I used to cry before class and cry before presentations. And later in life, I was like, wait a minute, my grandmother taught me about prayer. Wait a minute, the church that I went to taught me about justice. So it's really more about like challenging like what our perceptions are of learning and knowing theology. Is it just Karl Barth? Is it just Paul Tillich? Is it just, Friedrich Schleiermacher? Like some of the ones that are more classical, which is theology, but Latina theology, Mujerista theology, Asian American theology, Black liberation theology, they're all theologies, right? They're all different perspectives and ways of seeing God through the lens of other demographics. And so I thought to myself when I started writing this, wow, when I was in seminary, I had to realize, well, white men just don't own theology. But that's what I thought at the time. And again, I still love Paul Tillich, so it's not to throw out what I learned, right? It's one of my favorite theologians. It's really more like that we all encompass, that no one gets left out. And so I write in Womanish Theology about how I was taught those principles. I think about systematic theology and all of the books around systematic theology, and the titles of each of those books of each of those chapters being about, again, the Imago Dei, or about scripture, about predestination, if you're, Calvinist. But like, there are, in my book, I'm like, when did I learn about prayer? When do Black girls learn about scripture? When did we learn about theodicy? When did we learn, when did I learn about service and hospitality? So each of those chapters, the book is sort of structured the way that any old systematic theology book would be structured, but it tells my story a bit of where I learned those things, and I learned a lot of them in my Black girlhood. And I also interview other girls, contemporary girls, about, like, I didn't grow up, having to do active shooter drills in high school. Columbine was my senior year in high school. So this is the active shooter drill generation, and what does that mean? How do they perceive theodicy and, evil and suffering and, having to grow up, justice. I didn't care who the president was when I was 15 years old. I kind of remember now, because I feel like we were shielded from that, but this generation is so clued in. So their perspective of God, I think we can learn a lot from, or their perspective on these theological topics. So that's where Womanish Theology came from. And I just did a really, really quick brush. It's 11:35, but I wanted to just sort of like close there. I'm not sure if there's I want to leave room for like questions or comments or anything like that.
I have a question.
Okay.
Can you share, what did you learn from your grandmother about? I'm curious.
Oh man, it's so much. So when I was growing up, I grew up with a family that like dropped the kids off at the grandparents for summer, and my grandparents lived in North Carolina. My grandmother and my grandfather, and so school would let out, and then I would be shipped off. I didn't know it wasn't normal until later when I went back to school, and I'm like, you weren't with your grandmother for 3 months? So I was like potty trained by my grandmother, so it was kind of like, that was what we did. But my grandmother, first I talk a lot in the book about watching her pray. And those sort of observations of how she would wake up in the morning and read scripture and pray, and we couldn't really say anything. Like, it was really quiet in the house. We couldn't even really interrupt her until then. And how I learned how sacred that moment was and how important those moments were, even in my little adolescent mind. We didn't eat before praying, meal would get served and we would have to like read little scriptures called our daily bread around the table and say grace. There were so many things that I learned, but for the most part it was like you take it seriously and it's very important and it's relational. Relational was something that was like, God isn't just like some God out, and God is the God of us in community, right? And of our family. Before we traveled on the road, we'd all get together and we all prayed. I mean, it was just, it's a part of our lifestyle and a part of who we are. So when I got older or got to college, it stuck with me. And I didn't even realize originally that it sort of came from my grandmother. Before you go to bed, you get on your knees. Then when I was interviewing people, a lot of people were saying the same things. I've interviewed women, all different ages, and they would say they were taught, now I lay me down to sleep, or they were taught the Lord's Prayer. Those are a lot of things we learned like in our adolescence. Didn't even really realize it. So I had to do a lot of reflecting and going back and being like, it wasn't later in life, it was earlier. And even things like, if you didn't grow up in spiritual households, I mean, some of us even wrestled with theological things. Again, like evil and suffering, you especially this generation, they have to wrestle with it a bit more. And I'm curious, like how? I hear a lot of the kids saying, why would God allow this to happen? Is there a God? And those are theological questions. Katie Cannon, who is who really is known as the founder of womanist movement and womanist theology, not womanist movement, womanist theology, passed away. And she said in a video, she said at 3 years old, she was on the playground and she was wondering why she couldn't play with the white kids. Like why, back in the 60s or whatever. And so she was like, I was wrestling with a theological question around justice as a 3-year-old. Why do I have to deal with these types of things? Yolanda Pierce wrote a book called In Our Grandmother's House, and in my grandmother's house, and she talks a lot about her grandmother and the things that she learned from her grandmother, and I'm like, that's womanish theology. That's Black girlhood theology. So I think even outside of Black girlhood, if more of us did some reflecting on like why we believe what we believe and why we are who we are, a lot of it really comes back to things that were shaped in us really, really young. And for me to have an opportunity for 6 months to sit and really reflect on that and say, oh my God, that's when that was formed, or that's when I had this perception of a relational God, right? That was early on. Then I think we would get much further. Mm.
It's institutionalized.
Yeah.
And the people that went in there and looked at it were thinking, how do I identify with this?
Yeah. That's something. Yeah. Thank you.
So it's gone on for a long time.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to pick.
Yeah.
So, Khristi, recognizing your 451 sin with your
Oh,
time
St.
at
Paul's. I
St.
gotta talk
Paul's
about St.
schools,
Paul's.
do you have any? Can you share anything about how you feel your work is going and being a teacher?
I forgot to talk about St. Paul's. Okay, so let me thank you. Thank you. So my role at St. Paul's, my title is Executive Director of Community and Belonging. And I tell a lot of people that I think by May or June, I'll really be able to articulate what that means. Like I'm really excited about that moment, that aha moment. But a lot of that comes with getting to know a community. And so I think it's a fun challenge. Part of what my efforts are is overseeing some of the diversity and equity and inclusion efforts there, but it's clearly sort of beyond that. And it's a community, just like any other community, of all different people, distinctly different personalities. Each of the schools have their own personalities. Everyone has different political beliefs. They have different socioeconomic backgrounds. And it's just such a challenge of this is the challenge of the church, how to bring us together on one accord, to recognize those differences, to celebrate those and honor those differences, to leave space, right, and room for all of those, and for one person not to go unnoticed or missed or feel like they're not a part of the family or that they don't belong. It's the challenge of the world that we have that's in this sort of smaller microcosm of St. Paul's. And so I think if I can figure that out there, then maybe I'll try to run for president. I don't know. I think that's all of our challenges right now. First, when I got there, I thought it was just students because I've been student in my career. And so I'm like, all right, how do we get the kids together? But St. Paul's is so much more than just the young people. It's the staff, it's the teachers, it's the administrators, it's the people that serve in the dining hall, it's the parents, it's the alum, and everybody is fighting to be heard. Everybody's fighting to be seen. And it doesn't have to be a fight. It doesn't have to be Lord of the Flies. And I think that because of the leadership of this country and the direction that we've sort of gone in, I think people don't have to have the Lord of the Flies mentality, but I think it sort of has seeped down, and I would like to get us to a place where we could be this, we can live together and do more than coexist, but exist among one another to celebrate, to honor. But I really don't want, and I think I said this at one of the board meetings, like there's that scripture about what Jesus is like, leave the 99 and go in search of the one. I mean, that's sort of the goal that I have there too, that just because, out of 150 girls, 140 girls have somebody do their hair, 10 don't. And so how do we sort of recognize those 10 that don't? How do people not feel ostracized or the fear? How do we take the fear out of living in community? There's just so many things in my head, and I think it just starts with building relationships. Of course, that sounds like easier sort of said than done, or sounds really like a blanket, but I had someone come into my office I think she'd been thinking this for months, thinking that, like St. Paul's just hired you just to hire you. She didn't know me. And finally I reached out to a group and she came and she's like, I really thought that, She was like, I just thought it was just hired just to sort of check off a box. But she was like, thanks for, I bought her coffee. She was like, thanks for taking the time to sort of get to know us. And she was like, I want to help. How can I help? How can I, she wants to dive in. She sent me an email after. She's excited about the work. But, there was this uncertainty and this fear. And the only way I think those types of things are going to be managed is face-to-face, personal, touch, human being conversation, which we're not getting. And there's a lot of people to have that with at St. Paul, so it's going to take me a full year to do that. We'll go all the way in the back, these two, and then back up here. Either one.
I just wanted to commend you. It was so
Mhm.
grandmother. I grew up in North Carolina.
Oh.
And I'm a little bit older than you and kind of came up at a time in North Carolina when I too was called the N-word on the playground when I was 5 years old and not invited to birthday parties by girls at the private prep school where my parents had me because of the color of my skin. They wouldn't invite me to their parties and, so kind of growing up as that little black girl, kind of navigating. I had parents who were out of the 60s, a dad who's a civil rights lawyer who, I would come home with some of these issues and they just didn't play that.
Mhm.
So, I grew up feeling very empowered, really, to face this world. But, even now at age 55, I kind of walk that balance between some days it's justified anger, some days it's pure joy, and some days it's just racial fatigue. I'm just tired. Don't ask me anything. Why would I think about anything? I'm just tired. And so thank you for just kind of articulating those experiences. I can't wait to read your book because I want to see how you've done that in the spiritual context. A lot of what you talked about reminds me of Jacqueline Woodson's book, Groundhog Training. I have an 11-year-old niece in North Carolina who is multiracial, and so, we're always trying to get these books and experiences in front of her so she can really have a strong sense of who she is in this world and the value of who she is in this world. So just wanted to thank you and commend you for your work and for being here.
Oh, I think it was.
Okay. So Martin Luther King Jr. had a great line, right? The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I really also want to echo the extraordinary ministry that you are doing, this great calling that you've had to do this, and the ability to recognize that and to engage in that. I also understand that there are just times when you're tired and you just got to go be with your own. You just have to go find the gift of being with your own. But what I'm curious about, given King's arc, if you, since you've been doing this for a while, where are you finding, are you finding that the arc of the moral universe is bending towards justice? Are you finding that can you see progress? Where do you find hope in the middle of the ministry that you're doing?
Interesting question now. All I kept hearing in the last few weeks in my spirit is like the poor will always be among us. And we've sort of interpreted that in different ways. And the reason why I think that, or why I've been hearing that, is because I've been thinking, we're always going to be fighting? Are these things always going to be present? And what does that mean? And I'm finding, at least in the time that I've done this ministry, that there's extraordinary in the ordinary, like that there are glimpses and glimmers of hope, but they're not always in these sort of big, profound ways that that I've been looking for. Let me put it that way. And so it's easy for me to get bogged down by the higher level things. But then, when I have a conversation with a former student last week, she was leaving me a message. She was she's 16, and she's like, I just don't understand why things are going the way they're going, but, I just have to trust God. And then she just sort of went on to talk about this guy who's doing whatever at her school. But it was it was such a moment for me because I'm like, wow, she's just that phrase, right? From a 16-year-old, and it ministered to me, and it wasn't big and profound, but if she could trust God in the midst of this, but I'm just using that as an example because there's tiny spaces and people's little eyes that are looking at us, and people are growing and they're getting better and they're healing and they're, even finding it's like using COVID, horrible example, but when people think back to not COVID, but what that time did for a lot of people, right? That sort of forced people into spaces with, whether it's their loved ones and communities, that forced people to be creative. You know, I started baking. You know, I never would have baked before, and now I'm like baking for all and sending people things. It's like these little, like, in the midst of all the weeds, there's these little growth areas that are happening and these seeds that are sprouting. And I think that's where we need to draw our attention to, but it's hard when you see the whole field of weeds. It's kind of like the scripture, the treasure in a field, right? Where the man goes and, you know, he's like in search of a treasure or in search of something, and then he sees like a small treasure, but he goes out and he buys the whole field. I mean, it's like there's small treasures, I believe, that are around if we open our eyes to it. And then we'll come here. I think you had one. Yeah.
Reverend, you were saying, what do you find hopeful? I believe she is that hope that we have found that makes us smile and rejoice that someone like this exists. And the message that she has, she's continuing to carry on. So she's fulfilling that. But thank you. You know, the builder. And so for me, when I saw it in the program a couple weeks back, and again, reflecting where I've been in my age and where I've been, was none of the one of the only teams and things like that. So I certainly understand but we need that from our black women. We're going to get accepted first as black men, because at least one, it's going to be in this country. That's been the case for so many years. But just to say to her, thank you for what you're doing. Continue to grow. Continue to accept what God has intended you to do. Many of us know what God has intended we want to accept it. And others are still searching. But we have found that.
How do you think the identity formation of black girls is affected by the intersection of gender and race, and it's in the prep school environment?
Yeah. I think even outside of the prep school, but they have to do both. They're dancing constantly between both. And one of the things I've been noticing so I've not done, Hill was like co-ed. So I've always been in a classroom space so to be spending time a lot at St. Paul's School for Girls and watching, it's almost like sometimes the girls, particularly ones students of color, feel like they have to choose. It feels like they do, and so they say, I'm just gonna go with my girlhood. You know what I mean? They'll suppress their sort of cultural or ethnicity in order to be accepted. And not to say that there's not the struggle there with the girlhood, but it's like it's more of a unified struggle because there's more girls there. But I think it's a dance. It's sort of a constant that they have to deal with, and girls in general, you know, because whether it's discrimination or whether the misogyny that they experience is real too, and it's shared by young girls of other cultural identities. But sometimes the race part seeps in there, and they don't really know how to address it or feel bad, you know, for bringing it up, or just don't know how to navigate it because they're so few in number. So I think it's what happened, obviously, with womanism or black feminism. It was the issue of feminism in the 60s of like, well, the right to vote came about, but since I'm black, I can't vote. So, you know, so women can vote, but I can't vote. So it's this sort of constant dance back and forth, and the girls have to deal with it.
No, fantastic. Thank you. Tell everybody, where can they get your book?
You can get all of them on Amazon, or you can walk into any Barnes & Noble, and they're there, usually in the African American Studies section.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have them in my car.